Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to be kind of talking about a little bit of a broad subject, and it's just kind of something I've been mulling over in my head a little bit. It doesn't have anything really related to news, although it is kind of something that you can see a little bit prevalent in the film industry these days. And that's the idea of how to end a film, and specifically when it's good to have kind of a happy ending, that kind of fairy tale-ish ending, and when it's appropriate not to. And I think this kind of goes a little bit towards the Star Wars argument. It goes a little bit towards a few other arguments that I think a lot of people have had over, like, how to properly end and finish off things. And it goes into a little bit of the idea of sequels as well, which I've explained on here too, and how to end certain franchises and stuff like that. Like where is it right to leave off? And here's the thing: is that a lot of movies today try to do the quote unquote subversive thing. Where they're like, okay, we're gonna make you think we're going this way, but we're gonna go this way. And here's the thing with that is that when you do that type of subversion, you need to make sure that the subversion that you're doing is both equally, if not more, fulfilling than what the audience is expecting to happen. Because if it's not, if you just say, oh, this is all these people are lame and they're stupid and everyone's dead now, that's not usually an ending that people like when they're kind of rooting for characters. But if you kind of play up certain things and you say, okay, if you, it basically it's all in the execution for the most part. But let's take an example, again, because I kept mentioning Star Wars, let's take an example of Star Wars, the original trilogy. You have the first film, which was A New Hope, which was had a happy ending because they didn't honestly know if they were going to be able to make any more movies after that. So that film, in and of itself, had its own sort of happy ending. It could kind of be viewed on its own without the other films if you choose to omit those. But then you move on and you're making two more films after that because of the massive success of the first Star Wars film in 1977. So then you go into Empire Strikes Back. Now, Empire Strikes Back does not have a happy ending. Empire Strikes Back has a cliffhanger where Han Solo has been taken away with Boba Fett. You don't know what's going on with him. Luke has had his hand cut off, even though it's been replaced now. And everybody's kind of split up and doing their own thing, and they're all trying to find Han. And there's a bunch of things that have happened over the course of the movie that have been very dark. It was probably I think it's probably the darkest Star Wars film we've ever seen. Even maybe Revenge of the Sith can kind of rival that, especially with the physical violence, obviously. But then you move on to Return of the Jedi, and Return of the Jedi has a happy ending. It ends the series. You have Luke, who has now become a Jedi. You have Han and Leia, who are now cemented their relationship, and Han's been rescued. You have kind of the Jedi ghosts that are kind of looking over everybody as they kind of have won the war against the Empire, and the Emperor's been killed, and the second Death Star has been destroyed, and all that stuff. So you have that happy ending, and I think that's kind of the happy ending in and of itself is something that we learned from fairy tales a lot of the time. Stuff we're told when we're children. Those stories like, oh, the Little Red Riding Hood. How it has the happy ending where the wolf gets killed, and the grandmother and the Little Red Riding Hood are both saved by the huntsman. Or you have stuff like you can look at Hansel and Gretel is another one where you look at they get lost in the woods and they find this thing and they're going to get eaten, but then at the end of it they trick the witch and they're all fine. Most of them also have some kind of a lesson attached to them, but again, that's kind of where we start with that idea is when we children's stories, stories that are supposed to have happy endings, are supposed to make children feel kind of good. And that carries over into adulthood when we watch certain films as well, even though Star Wars is kind of aimed at children for the most part. But the thing is that makes sense because Star Wars was modeled a lot after kind of a fairy tale type of atmosphere. It's a fantasy film. It's science fiction fantasy, but it definitely has a lot of fantasy in it. And that's what Lucas wanted it to kind of feel like, was the ending to a fairy tale. That's what it feels like. It's exactly what it feels like. And that's why it works. And that's because we've also been following these characters for 3 films, and we want to see them kind of have their happy ending and ride off into the sunset. Obviously, the sequel trilogy ruined that, but then you can also look at stuff like a movie like Gladiator from Ridley Scott, which it wouldn't have been true to give Maximus a happy ending. Even though he kind of got the happy ending, it's not necessarily a happy ending. Because the thing with that is that it's kind of a bittersweet happy ending because he dies. But the whole idea of that end, at the end of that film, is that he's going to go see his wife and his son, which were killed at the beginning of the film. And that's kind of his thing is he gets to pass away. He's taken his revenge. He's killed Commodus, who's played by Joaquin Phoenix, and he's kind of going off into the afterlife. But at the same time, he had the chance to be with the other love of his life. And he had the chance to help raise her son, and he had the chance to do all these other things. But that was his ending. That was the ending that was true to his character, and that's the ending that made sense to him. It made sense in terms of the film as like, okay, this guy has been on this revenge-fueled, death march for most of the film, and basically by the end of it, you kind of realize what's going to happen. You know that he's not going to make it out alive. You know that a lot of the people that he's been fighting with are dead as well. And it's one of those things where, it's the logical end to the character, and that's the way it should have been. But you can look at other films, too, where, you have endings that are done where things don't work out, and maybe they should, and it's kind of pointing to that sort of thing where I'm trying to think of a very good example, but there are some films, actually Terminator Dark Fate is kind of a good example of this. Is the idea of because Terminator 2 kind of had that sort of, I wouldn't say happy ending, but it was a happy-ish ending because John Connor lived, Sarah Connor was reunited with him. Even though the T-800 had to liquefy himself, they believed that they had stopped Judgment Day, and that was kind of the thing like, oh, there is no fate but what you make, the idea of the film. And then you go to Terminator Dark Fate, which is the continuation of that, and John Connor gets iced in the first 5 minutes of the movie, and you're kind of like, okay, you've carried this forward too much. It should have ended there, probably. Because here's the thing, is that if you carry a story on too long, it kind of mirrors real life in a way, because the thing is, and, you can disagree with me on this if you want, but in reality, all of our lives are tragedies. That's how it works. Because at the end of our lives, we all die. It doesn't matter how old you are, whatever. Everybody dies eventually. And the point is that, if you carry a story on too long, eventually it always turns into a tragedy. And audiences don't always like that because they want to kind of think of these characters as timeless. They want to think of these characters as like, we left them off here and we like to think that, oh, they lived happily ever after. That's kind of the idea. Or we see the character die and we end it there, and it's done tastefully and it's done in relation to the character. Another good example of, having it done properly is probably the original Watchmen comic book, or if you want to view the movie as well. Because most of those characters have the ending. They grow as characters throughout the novel and throughout the film, and they ultimately get the endings that are fitting to their characters. Rorschach is killed, which is fitting to his character because he was unwilling to compromise with the idea that Adrian Veidt was putting forth of to keep the world at peace using basically a ruse. Dr. Manhattan kind of goes off to kind of experiment with his new rediscovered humanity and kind of, basically play God, or start a new universe. Laurie and Dan Drayberg, they both fall in love with each other. Laurie's kind of Dan's ideal type of girl, and Laurie is attracted to Dan because he's more human, he's more down to earth, he's more emotionally resonant than Dr. Manhattan was, even though he's obviously basically a god. And Ozymandias is left alone to basically just live out the rest of his days knowing what he's done, knowing the horrible things that he's done. And that's what makes all the endings for those characters so very pertinent to the way that they operated throughout the story. It's like it makes sense for them to be at these points at the end of the story. It is satisfying to the story to see that, and it works, but it's not prototypical of a superhero story. You expect them to save the day. You expect them to, stop this coming apocalypse or whatever, but they don't. and but it works because we get to see it. Um, and there's other there's other things that you can go into with it, but ultimately the bottom line to the whole argument is that you need to know when to end your story, and you need to know how to end your story given your characters and given your narrative, and you need to know when it's too much to carry on and when you ruin that ending. Marvel could very well do that in the next few years too. After Endgame, you could very well see that the films that are, I predict that they might be, is that the films, Endgame should have been it. Endgame should have been the ending. Maybe add the Spider-Man film onto that to kind of have the falling action, but the Endgame film should have been the end of it because that was just everything had built up to that point, and at the end of that movie, kind of everybody kind of got their endings that they deserved. Again, Captain America deserved to have his happy little ending because he had been suffering over the course of the MCU because he had been, ripped away from the woman he loved, and he had been basically living as a man out of time. And then Tony Stark gets his tragic ending because that is more fitting for his character because he's always blaming himself for everything, and in the end he is the one that sacrifices himself to save everybody else, and that's why it makes sense. um, but that's just kind of the thing, is that a lot of Hollywood directors nowadays don't, or a lot of Hollywood studios, I should say, don't know when and how to end their franchises or end their films or end, even if it's not a franchise, maybe just a small series of films. You need to understand when you have a good ending and when you should stop with that storyline. Maybe do something else. Maybe, if even if it's a big universe like Star Wars, start somewhere else. Start in the past. Start in the future. If it's something like Marvel, maybe you go a full reboot route or do something else, or something like that. But I mean, it's too big of a cash cow, obviously, to give up for them. But the idea is still there that you need to understand when certain things should be stopped and when it's all right to stop them and when it's appropriate. And that's just kind of my message in this, is that endings are very, very important, and they need to be understood not only by the directors but by the studios that are pumping these films out. If you're going to have long, long format and fulfilling narratives. But again, that's just me. But I want to know what your opinion is. Do you agree with my stance on happy endings, sad endings, stuff like that, and when certain things should be ended and when they shouldn't, or are you kind of one of those people that, like, if there's a good story to be told, then you can carry it on and you can do this and do that. It really lies more with the creative minds behind it, as opposed to when you should leave the narrative off. Again, I like to know what you're thinking, so put your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?